So that's really what an EPC contract is all about. And I think the standard form for an EPC contract is usually the FIDIC Silver Book. That's a good starting point for anyone who is looking to put together an EPC contract, essentially. So what's the importance of construction in project finance? I think the first thing is that it's the largest single component of capital costs. So, like what I had said before, that's where the bulk of the capital go. Quality and efficiency of the design and the construction of the plant will impact the project expenditure and revenues throughout the project operation. So that's also why it's absolutely important, because really, if at the end of the day, the power plant, for instance, is not performing optimally, you'll find that would undermine the entire project financing for that particular deal. So it's important that the plant, whether it's a refinery or a power plant, is absolutely performing optimally. Another point to note is that completion of the construction and commissioning by a specific date is often fundamental condition for the concession or for the offtake arrangement. Timeliness or delay in completion of the project will impact the project economics. So certainty in terms of time is also absolutely crucial. So now we're going to look at the following issues that are pertinent to project sponsors when engaging in a construction contract. Like I had said before, the first thing to note is that, and I've not seen a lender who would not insist on an EPC. Lenders would often insist in having an EPC arrangement where the entire risk from construction to design to engineering to procurement is placed in one single person who is the EPC contractor. The other thing to note is that another thing that I've seen, particularly in my experience when working on a modular refinery, is that the employer had actually nominated a subcontractor. The subcontractor who had experience with respect to CDU, what you call your crude distillation unit, which is a core component of a refinery. But nevertheless, they wanted the EPC contractor to take on a single point responsibility. They didn't want to do a split contract. In other words, one contract with the CDU, the person who is fabricating the CDU and installing it, and another contract with the contractor who is doing the civil work surrounding the refinery plant. No, they wanted one contractor to take on both responsibility. So even though they nominated a subcontractor to do the CDU, they wanted the EPC contractor to enter into a subcontract arrangement with the CDUs, with the subcontractor who was doing the CDU, so that the EPC contractor continued to take on its ultimate responsibility for any failures resulting from the subcontract work as well. So that's how crucial having a single point response or having an EPC contract arrangement is from the lender's perspective. Another thing we'd probably talk about things around, the limitation of liability provision, because usually that's also another key battleground when having this form of negotiations. But let's start by just discussing the basics first of all. So I think the first thing is who has the design responsibility. That's crucial. So when reviewing this contract, when looking at it, I think the first thing you want to be sure is that, like I said, the lenders would insist on an EPC so that the EPC contractor takes on both the design responsibility and the construction responsibility. In such case, it's very important for you to have a good definition for what a good industry practice is. So you find that sometimes those terms are not actually defined in the contract. But in order to benchmark the performance obligation of the contractor, you want to actually define those terms so that there's a lot of clarity. The other thing to note is that, question to ask is what rest the work. Another thing to think about is, whether completion should be based on a section of the work or completion should be based on the overall work itself. So this is crucial because that determines how your liquidated damages provision is structured. If it's absolutely very crucial for a certain section of the work to be completed at a certain time, then you probably attach a liquidated damage, a completion obligation as well as the liquidated damage provision tied to that section of the work. So those are things to think about. At what point is the contractor required to achieve the completion of the work? Is it with respect to a section or with respect to the overall work itself, in order to determine when liquidated damages begins to run for delays in completing the project? Another thing to think about, which is absolutely very important in these types of process where you have process plants, is does the contract have a testing process? Now, it's important because if you are looking at a refinery, for instance, right, the question is, at what point can you say that the contractor has achieved his completion obligation? So the contractor is meant to complete the work within a certain time. So at what point has he actually completed the work, right? The only way to know is when you carry out a test upon completion in order to determine whether the contractor has met the design and the performance output for that particular project itself. So typically, when you see this contract, you see what you call a pre-commissioning test and a commissioning test. A pre-commissioning test simply means it's the code tests that you carry out on the plant in order to determine whether the plant is ready to actually be commissioned. So you do not put in a feed for a refining or a processing by the power plant. No, you simply just carry out a code test, checking whether everything has been put together and everything is well installed and ready for it to be commissioned. The commissioning test actually is where you actually feed into the plant, the feed, in order to determine whether it's actually working. Is it producing? Is it refining at the capacity that is required? That's what happens when you carry out a commissioning test in order to see whether the plant is commercially viable and whether it can start commercial operations effectively. Now, when you see some EPC project, you find what you call performance guarantees. You find what you call performance guarantees and performance liquidated damages. So essentially, the performance requirement is structured in such a way where there are some absolute guarantees and non-absolute guarantees. Now, the absolute guarantees are the minimum requirements that must be met by the contractor. If the plant does not achieve the minimum requirements, then the employer is entitled to reject the plant and terminate the contract and claim damages for breach of contract, essentially. In other words, if it doesn't meet the minimum requirements in terms of performance output, it just simply means that the test on completion failed. And it's either the EPC contractor continues to, tries to rectify whatever error, or the employer can simply just trigger his right to reject the plant and probably terminate the contract. So that's what you talk about when you talk about absolute guarantees. Then non-absolute guarantees are, performance output where, it provides some sort of allowance where the contractor may fail. So the contractor, even though the contract requires that the plant should be performing at this level, right? Provided it's performing at the minimum level required. So if it's not performing up to the optimal level, the optimal guarantee envisaged under the contract, the employer can still accept the plant, subject to the EPC contractor paying what you call performance liquidated damages for not meeting the optimal performance level.